Hello, everybody. Good morning to you in my time zone, and good early morning to those on the west coast of the United States, and good afternoon to those of you who may be overseas in Europe or beyond. My name is Mel Granick. I'm KS2G, and this is basics of HF operating. This is the longest standing presentation of Ham Radio University for the past 25 years. So I'm going to be going through this at light speed. I'm going to try to leave some room for questioning and try to do all of this in like 50 minutes or thereabout in less than 50 minutes to give us some time for some questions. If I don't get to questions, bear in mind this entire presentation will be posted in slide form on the hamradiouniversity.org website, and it will eventually be posted on the Ham Radio University YouTube channel. The past versions of this presentation are already posted in both of these places. So without further ado, let me go here and back up here and get my screen to where I can see it. Hold on. And okay. All right. So basics of HF operating. I'm going to try to give you a quick overview of ham radio operating on the HF bands. I want to give a quick shout out to the memory of our founder, Phil Lewis, and to MUN, my good friend and the founder of the concept of Ham Radio University all those many years ago. And Phil went SK, unfortunately, in 2020, and we all miss him dearly. So before I start, let's get a quick poll. George, get ready for this. I want to find out who's out there. Let us know by clicking on the poll what your HF operating experience has been, whether you've never operated HF every now and then or operate HF a lot. Put the poll up, George.
It's up.
Okay, you'll let me know the results. Organizer must close poll to enable screen sharing.
Yeah, we've got 3/4 of the people have voted. Take another 5, 6, 7 seconds. Okay, going to close the poll in 5 seconds. Almost everybody's voted. Okay, closing. And Mel, can you see the results? Or you want me to read it to you?
Why don't you? I don't see it. I don't see it. Why don't you read it to me?
If you look in audience view, you should see it.
Hold on a second. I got to get back to this. Oh, here it is. Let's see, but it's very small. Hold on. It's too small for me to read, George. Just give me a readout real quick.
Okay, you can always make that larger, but I'll. Yeah, I've never operated HF 27%. I operate HF every now and then, 55%. I operate HF a lot, 18%.
Okay, great. So basically, we've got a quarter of you are newbies to HF, and a lot of you are only casual HF operators, and only a few of you are of HF operators a lot. And I hope I can give you some useful information for everybody. Just a quick note. Since this is a potentially worldwide presentation, all of the license, band plan, regulatory information that you'll be hearing and seeing is applicable only to U.S. licensees under the authority of the Federal Communications Commission. If you're outside FCC authorization, your mileage may vary, as they say. So let's go real quick. What are the HF bands? The HF bands are 10 frequency ranges between 1.8 and 30 megahertz. I've listed them out here. I won't bother reading them off to you. They're 160 through 10 meters. They're all continuous allocations with the exception in the United States of the 60-meter band, which has 5 specific channels. All the rest are continuous allocations in the ranges that you see on your screen. So 160 through 10 meters are the HF bands, and you can see there's a whole long list of them. So the question arises, why are there so many HF bands? Why do amateur radio operators get so much bandwidth? Well, each HF band has a particular propagation characteristics. And some bands are good for long-range communications, some are better for short-range communications, depending on whether it's daytime or nighttime, depending on whether we're in the summer or winter in your particular hemisphere, and whether you're at the top of the maximum sunspot cycle or down near the bottom where sunspots are at their minimum. So all of these different bands have different characteristics depending on these various factors. Also, the different bands have different characteristics in terms of ambient noise level, which can affect both propagation and your ability to find the bands useful. And last but not least, the types of QSOs that you find most often vary from band to band. Some bands are more popular among, let's say, DXers and contesters. Some bands are more popular among rag chewers and experimenters. So the different characteristics of the bands play into that. So you'll hear references when we talk about the HF bands. There are the lower bands and there are higher bands. The lower bands are 160 through 40 meters, and this is a lower in frequency rather than in bandwidth. The lower bands tend to be better in the winter time than in the summer. Noise levels are lower, for example, on the lower in the winter time. They're better at the bottom of the sunspot cycle rather than at the top of the sunspot cycle in terms of propagation, and I'll be explaining why that's so in just a minute or two. Also, the local regional daytime bands, and at night they're better for DX, and again, because of the propagation characteristics of those bands, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. The higher bands, which are 30 through 10 meters, they're the mirror image of the lower bands. They're better in the summertime, generally speaking, than in the winter time. They're much better at the top, the maximum of the sunspot cycle. They're DX bands in the daytime and night at the top of the cycle, and they tend to be DX bands in the daytime, but they close completely, become almost completely useless for long distance communication at night at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. So that's why lower versus higher bands, keep that in mind. Let's look at the HF sub-bands. And again, I'll remind you, this is, I'm talking in terms of the regulations for US licensees. Each HF band is divided into frequency ranges for specific modes and specific license classes. The modes, CW, digital data, and phone. And the license classes, there are privileges that are different. Novices and technicians have minimal HF allocations that they're permitted to operate on. The general licensees in the United States have about half of the bandwidth of the HF bands. The advanced class operators, the remnants of advanced class operators, have even more bandwidth. There are no longer any new advanced class licenses being issued, but current advanced class operators can renew their licenses, and extras have all the bandwidth on all the bands. And as I said, they're also divided by mode. Let's look at CW. CW is permitted on any frequency on any band. You can operate CW any way you'd like. However, by convention, CW operating is generally found in the lowest part of each band. You'll hear about the CW subbands, but there's not a CW subband other than by convention. You can operate CW anywhere on the HF bands, generally found in the lowest part of each band. Digital and data, things like RIDI and FT8 and so forth, are permitted in the lower part of each band, overlapping the so-called CW subband, but they're generally found just above the CW section so that they don't interfere with CW operators. And then we come up to phone, and the phone is permitted in the upper half to 3/4 of each band. Now, by convention, when you're operating single sideband, you operate lower sideband on the 40-meter bands and down, so 40, 80, 160, you use lower sideband. And for above 40 meters, you use upper sideband. And again, this is not a regulation, it's a convention. There's nothing to prevent you from operating upper sideband on 40 meters, but you generally just don't do it. You'll occasionally hear a signal on 40 meters as you're tuning the band. You can't quite tune it and you can't figure out why. And that may be because the operator either intentionally or inadvertently is operating on an upper sideband. And if you reverse that, you'll be able to tune them in. I didn't put it on the slide because I didn't have room. There's still AM operating on phone, and that exists on the upper end of, by convention, the upper end of the each HF band. And then there is FM phone permitted on the 10-meter band in the United States from 29.6 and above at the very tippy top, at the very high end of the 10-meter band. How do you keep track? I have one of these handy dandy charts and sitting on my desk. I'm an extra class operator. I can go anywhere that I want, but I keep this in mind. Excuse me. I keep this in, on my desk so I know where other operators are permitted to go. So for example, if I'm in a contest and I want to make sure that I get as many general class operators as I can, I will generally put down my CQ in the general subband. So you can get one of these online. You can go to the ARRL website. You don't have to copy down the exact URL that I put at the bottom of the slide. Just go to the ARRL website and put in the search box amateur band chart, and something like this will come back in various forms that you can look at on screen, and you can download and print out for your very own. Bear in mind, as I said, the HF bands are continuous. They're not channelized. A lot of people who come from VHF and UHF are used to round figure frequencies. You don't have to use any particular frequency. There are no so-called, calling frequencies like on 2 meters or 440, although by convention, different operators gravitate towards different frequency locations. You don't have to use a frequency that ends in a 0. You'll find this, it's for old time operators. I'll put down a CQ and someone will come back to me, and the station on the other end will say, you're off frequency. Well, I can't be off frequency because I'm the one who called CQ. You're not tuning in my frequency because you're trying to tune me into a 0.00 frequency. So you don't have to use any particular frequency, and it doesn't have to end in 0. The one exception to this, as I pointed out earlier, is 160 meters. It's not a contiguous allocation for amateur radio use. It's 5 specific 2.8 kilohertz wide channels, and it's centered on these frequencies: 5332, 5348, 5358.5, 5373, and 5405 kilohertz. Also on the 160 meter band, no matter what your license class, power is limited to effective radiated power equal to 100 watts PEP using a dipole. If you use some other kind of antenna, you have to note that in your station information. So even though you may be an extra and you have 2 kilowatt allocation elsewhere, you're limited to 100 watts PEP on 60 meters. Bear in mind, when you're operating on the HF bands and single sideband, have to be aware of the band edges for all those bands and subbands that I just talked about. On single sideband, your bandwidth is typically 2.5 to 3 kilohertz wide. So therefore, you have to stay at least 3 kilohertz away from the edge of any band or subband. That is where you put your VFO frequency, should be 3 kilohertz away from the band edge. So on lower sideband, you have to be 3 kilohertz above the bottom edge of the allocation, and on upper sideband, you need to be 3 kilohertz below the top edge of the band. So how does this work? Let's take a look. At the bottom of the 40 meter general phone band, the bottom is 7.175 megahertz. So you have to set your VFO to transmit no lower than 7.178, else the 3 kilohertz bandwidth will put you outside the band. The converse of that, when you use upper sideband, let's say on the very top of the 20 meter phone band is 14.350 megahertz. You want to set your VFO to transmit no higher than 14.347, otherwise you'll be outside the band. And here's an example of that. This is something that I found on a contest a couple of years ago. Here's a look at the very top of the 20 meter band, 14.347 to 14.350, and you can see VE9CB is right at 347. Now II2S, by the way, those numbers after the call sign are their beam headings. II2S, his VFO looks like it's at about 347.08 or something like that. He's below 348. But if you look at his the width of his frequency, hold on a second, let me back this up again. Hold on. Here we go. I want to be able to point here. So here's his VFO frequency right here, 347 point something, but he's 2.5 kilohertz wide, and the top end of his signal is above 350. The band edge is at 350. So he's out of band. If you're a US operator and you tune to his VFO, you should not answer him, because you'll be out of band. Okay, bear that in mind. As we said, 2.5 to 3 kilohertz bandwidth. Make sure your VFO reads 3 kilohertz below the band edge. So what modes where on each band? We have all these bands and we have all these modes, and how do we know what to do where? Here's a handy dandy chart called the Consider It Operators Frequency Guide, and this gives you the conventions of where everybody tends to operate in this mix of modes and bands and so forth. If you look down at the bottom, there's a URL that you can try to scribble down. As I said, this deck will be up on the Ham Radio University website, so you can get it from there or look at last year's presentation on the website. The deck is there. Or you can go into Google or your favorite web searcher and just search Consider It Operators Frequency Guide, and this chart will come off and it'll show you where the various conventions put there. So for example, as I said here, looking at the 80 meter band, there's a so-called DX window where people are looking for and trying to work DX from 3500 to 3510, and then there's a QRP calling frequency here. Iridian data tends to gravitate be 3570 to 3600. Over here you got RIDI DX. Over here you got the guys who operate SSTV, who tend to be very protective of their frequency on each band. Over here on the 40 meter band, for example, they tend to be at 14230 233, and they tend to be very protective of that. So the Consider It Operators band shows you where most people are operating, so you don't get in the way of people operating a different mode than you are in the different bands. The digital modes, which are very popular, and no, you're not going blind. This is too blurred for you to see because the image of this particular chart is too small to fit into the slide. And again, this is amateur radio HF digital mode frequencies. Put that into a search engine and you'll come up with this this color-coded guide to where the various digital operating frequencies are, what I call the alphabet soup modes of the various digital modes. All have their particular frequencies that they gravitate toward. And of course, the most popular digital mode these days is FT8, and it has these particular frequencies that people tend to gravitate toward. One good thing, if you use the standard FT8 software, WJTX has these built in, and there's a little box on your screen where you click on, let's say 80 meters, and it will put you on 3573 automatically. You don't have to tune into it with your VFO. The tuning is quite precise for FT8 anyway, so you want to have the software tuned to the frequency that you want. By one recent estimate, FT8 remains the most popular HF mode at the moment as the sunspot cycle picks up some of the phone bands that are getting more active. But by one account, FT8 accounts for maybe 3/4 of all HF activity. So these are the FT8 modes to keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit about propagation, because the whole reason to get on to the HF bands is to do long distance communication for the most part, and that requires propagation. And let's go through the basics real quick. There are two kinds of radio waves. There are ground waves, which follow the ground, and there are sky waves that go up into the air, as the name applies. As you can see in the illustration here, ground wave tends to be pretty much straight line point to point, follows the ground and the curvature of the Earth. Sky waves go up to here toward the sky and toward the ionosphere, which becomes important to us in just a minute. Ground wave tends to be limited in distance. If you look at this this chart, you can see here that as you go up in frequency, you get more ground wave coverage, and this is why the lower bands, let's say, tend to be not so great for ground wave, right? If you look at down here at the bottom frequency in megahertz, 160 meters is not very good for ground wave propagation, and as you go higher, you get more of a distance, and here's why. Okay, HF propagation depends on the ionospheric layers. So here's a look at the Earth. Here's the day side of the Earth. Here's what they call the gray line. I'll talk about that in a minute. This is where it's nighttime. And here are the ionosphere layers that we're interested in: the D layer, the E layer, and the F layers, the F region layers. And you'll notice that on the day side of the planet, you have all of these layers, D, E, and F1 and F2. As you go toward nighttime, as you get to the gray line here, the D layer tends to fade out and the E layer tends to fade out. And then in the dead of night, those layers disappear altogether, and you're left with just the merged F region, the F layers. And we're going to talk about why that's important right now. The ionosphere can refract the sky waves. The ionosphere is a layer of electrically charged particles in the upper atmosphere. And what happens is when your RF signal goes into the ionosphere, those electrically charged particles get in the way of it traveling through, and they get bent back down toward the Earth. A couple of years ago when I used to do this a lot, I used to talk about the ionosphere reflecting back HF signals, and someone took me to task and said, Mel, it's not like a mirror. There's no angle there. It's a bending. It's a refraction of this. So your HF signal goes up into the ionosphere. The electronically charged particles push it back down toward the Earth, and that's what gives us long distance communication, thusly so-called skip. Okay, so here's our illustration of how skip works. Here's the surface of the Earth, right? Ground wave will go straight ahead and will run out of distance if we go straight ahead in ground wave somewhere around here as the Earth curves away from where the signal is going. And up here we have the ionosphere. This is an example of a signal for, on the 10-meter band in the 28 megahertz range. What happens is if you point a signal on 28 megahertz straight up, most likely what will happen is that the ionosphere will refract it a little bit, but it will still go up and through and out into outer space where it does you no good for our purposes. As you change this angle of radiation, the refraction bends the signal about the same amount, and as the angle changes, you finally get to a point here, this critical angle here, where when the signal reaches the ionosphere, it's refracted enough to get pushed back down toward the Earth. And this is this critical angle is what's important here and is governed by the type of antenna you use and the height at which that antenna is situated. To give you what's so-called angle of radiation. When you look at antenna specs, you look at angle of radiation. That's why a vertical, for example, has a very low angle of radiation like this and will give you a longer skip distance like the one we see here from New York to Denver, Colorado, skipping over, let's say, Chicago long distance. An HF beam, the higher up you put it, the lower the angle of radiation goes like this, and again, gives you a longer skip distance, right? So you'll notice that the skip distance becomes important, and this is why on HF, you may hear signals here longer distance away than you do shorter distance here, because these signals are you're skipping over. If you want to reach Chicago, the skip distance is too far, and you're missing out on Chicago over here, but you're hearing Denver just fine. This is why you'll often hear so-called little pipelines on an HF band for certain parts of the country. The other day I was working on a contest, and I must have worked like 10 Texas stations in a row because this skip distance was perfect for signals to and from Texas. So long distance refraction gives you what we call skip. Now, notice here that we don't have too many options here in terms of reaching closer in signals or even further away signals. This takes us out to Denver. What if I want to go out here someplace to California or out into the Pacific or something? How do we do that? Well, we get to we call multi-hop propagation. And what happens in multi-hop is the Earth and the ionosphere work in tandem. And what happens here, this is an example of an 80-meter signal, a 3.5 megahertz signal. What happens is the signal goes up at the first at the critical angle, and we get several critical angles here, which will give us close-in propagation to Chicago. But what if we want to go beyond Chicago? What if we want to reach Denver? What happens here, we hope, is that our signal goes up into the ionosphere, gets refracted down to the Earth, and the Earth reflects it back up into the ionosphere and pushes it back out to the longer distance that we want to reach. Okay, so we got propagation here, which is single hop skip. And what we got here is multi-hop skip. And this can happen over and over again. The signal can go down here and it can be reflected again and again and again. And this is why on, let's say, these lower bands, for example, where you're depending on a lot of multi-hop propagation, the signal gets weaker each time this happens, of course, because the Earth is not a perfect mirror to reflect the signal back up and back down. And every time it enters the ionosphere, you get a little bit of a loss as it's refracted down to the back down to the Earth. So this raises the question of which bands when, okay, because of this propagation. And again, the lower frequency bands tend to be ground wave in the daytime for local regional communication, skywave at night for DX, and the upper frequency bands are the converse of that, both ground wave and skywave day and night when the bands are open. So HF propagation is key to the D layer of why this happens. And let's look at the reason why, okay? The D layer absorption, as we're about to talk about, is really key. What happens is with the D layer when it exists, the D layer tends to absorb lower frequency signals. So here's an example of an 80-meter wave, goes up and down, hits the ionosphere, because of the wavelength, spends a lot of time, let's call it, in the D layer, and the D layer ionization absorbs a lot of the signal, and the signal comes out the other side either weak or non-existent. Whereas on a 10-meter signal, where the wavelength is tighter, the signal goes into the D layer and can pass through it because it doesn't spend so much time, let's call it, in the D layer, and there's minimal absorption, and you can get signals through the D layer in the daytime. So in the daytime, the 80-meter wave gets absorbed by the D layer, and you don't get any skip, you don't get any propagation. You go on 10 meters, and the D layer doesn't pose much of a problem. Frequency and ionization level, again, as I just said, hey, let's look at this. Relatively low ionization, a 28 megahertz signal will pass straight through the D layer, and a 3.5 megahertz signal will pass through, where we have a low ionization. With high ionization in, let's say, the E layer, you get the 3.5 megahertz wave bending down and the 28 megahertz wave bending more of an absorption situation. If you want a perfectly good and more detailed explanation of this, better than the one I just gave you, and you can spare 30 minutes of your time, go to YouTube and search the effects of ionization on radio wave propagation, and you'll find this 30-minute presentation from the 1940s by the US Army, which is one of the best presentations I've ever seen on the explanation of HF propagation. So go to YouTube, effects of the ionosphere on radio wave propagation. We talked about ionization. Ionization is determined by sunspot activity. More sunspots, more ionization, more DX at higher frequencies. Sunspots, as you probably know, rise and fall in an 11-year cycle. That was determined back in the 1840s by Heinrich Schwab. He retroactively started numbering them with cycle number 1 at 1755 to 1766. Here's a look at all the various cycles from 1750 or so forth till the present day. Back here, you see what you may have heard of the Maunder minimum. This is when there was, basically no ionization back here in the 1600s to 1700s. Thanks God, didn't affect radio propagation back then. We start seeing more normal peaks and valleys of each sunspot cycle here, starting in the 1700s that Schwab looked at. We had a Dalton minimum, which wasn't as bad as the Maunder minimum back in the 1800s, and again, didn't affect radio propagation. There wasn't any radio back then. Here's present day, starting about the 1900s, and you can see the rise and fall of each of these cycles. The best cycle was this one, cycle 19, peak of cycle 19 was the best one, and you can see this rise and fall in not only each cycle but in the cycle, what we call the cycle of cycles. And what we have seen in recent years is that it appears that the strength of each cycle most recently has been declining. We just came off cycle 24. It was not quite as good as cycle 23, which wasn't as good as 22, which wasn't as good as 21. So the fear was that cycle 25, which just started in December of 2019, wasn't going to be so good. Looks like we're off to a good start here. This is the end of cycle 24. This is the start of cycle 25. This is, red line is sort of the consensus prediction of what the cycle would likely to be looking like. And as you can see, we're off to a good start here. We're doing a little bit better than the consensus prediction. Solar conditions vary from day to day. In the age of the internet, the good news is you can find out what's going on almost, pretty much in real time. You can find a box like this on the home page of QRZ.com and elsewhere on the internet. This gives you a whole lot of different information about what's going on in terms of propagation, sort of at the moment. The numbers I like to look at, make it real easy, are these three numbers here: SFI, solar flux index. This is SN is sunspot number. Solar flux index is a measure of the ionization of the various layers. The A index and the K index indices are reflections of absorption. So what you want to look for is a high SFI number and low A and K numbers. The higher this number is, while these numbers are low, the better the propagation is when you look at a chart like this one. You can also calculate the likelihood of a particular path based on current sunspot conditions in a calculator like VOACAP, VOACAP.com. And what happens in VOACAP, it's an online calculator and it's free. You put in your location here, you plug in the location of where you're trying to reach. In this case, it's Australia. And what happens over here, it gives you a readout in a color-coded way of what the propagation of that path looks like based on the time of day. As you can see, here is, in 24-hour clock, there's nothing basically here on these upper bands at the time of day for this path. And over here, there's a minimum of propagation up to maybe 20–30% chance of this path. So this is a predictive calculator. There also are real-time path views like this one on DX maps. And this one, each of these lines is a QSO that's taking place at the time. This looks like this particular one. We're looking at 40 meters at this particular time of day. And you can see it. There's a lot of activity on 40 meters stateside here. There's some propagation, north-south propagation down to South America. There's a fair amount of propagation on 40 meters this time of day into Europe, less so in North Africa, down in South Africa, Southern Africa. There's basically nothing going on here. Nobody's making this path. And over here out in Australia, New Zealand, and the coasts of Eastern Asia, there's nothing going on here. So real-time path views are available also. Of course, you can also just turn on your radio, as I did in this screenshot, and you can look at the band that you're interested in operating on. You can see how much activity is. If you have in the old days, what you do is you turn on the radio, start tuning across the band to hear what you could hear. If you have a newer radio with a band scope or an external band scope, you can look at the activity. Here's the activity on 20 meters. As you can see down here at the low end of 20 meters, there's a lot of CW going on over here. This bright spot, which you're going to find on almost every band, almost any time of the day or night. This is FT8, as I talked about before, and over here there's a fair amount of phone activity up here. These look like, based on the plot, these look like single sideband. This might be over here, this more continuous plot over here. This might be an AM signal over here at the top end of 40 meters, as I talked about earlier. So how to make contacts? Okay, proactively, obviously. On a repeater, you key up your microphone, you say listening. You give your call sign KS2G listening. On the HF bands, you call CQ. You tune the band, okay? You go back to here. As I said, over here, you'll find an open spot, like maybe somewhere over here. and you tune your VFO to that open spot, and you call CQ. You ask if the frequency is in use, because as we said in skip, you may be only hearing one side of a conversation because of the skip zones. So always ask if the frequency is in use, and QRL with a question mark on CW, for example. And then you call CQ. CQ should be long enough so that someone tuning across the band or looking at their scope sees your plot and sees that there's someone there looking for a contact. I always like to give my call phonetically. Kilo Sierra 2 Golf, and I always like to say it's near New York City, because nowadays the number in your call sign in the United States tells you nothing about where I might be located. I happen to be located in New York, but there are 2 land stations, a lot of them in Florida, a lot of them elsewhere in the country, in Arizona and somewhere. There are KH6s, which you would think are Hawaii, but they're in Florida. So I like to give my my location on CQ and RIDI. Again, when you call CQ, you say CQDE means from, and you give your call sign, and you give it several times. Make the CQ long enough that will attract attention. If you're responding to CQs in casual contacts, you give the call sign of the station you're calling, and then you give your call sign second. Again, in CW and RIDI, his call sign first, followed by your call sign. If you're working DX, if you're working contests, or you're working pile-ups, just give your call sign. You don't have to give his call sign. Give it phonetically on phone. And determine also, is the DX station operating split. Almost all stations, all DX stations, all DX expeditions operate split nowadays, which means you don't want to be calling on his frequency. Operating split is like you transmit on a different frequency than you receive. It's like the offset of a repeater input output. On a repeater, you on a 2-meter radio on a repeater, you tune in the receive frequency. That would be where the DX is, and the offset is where you transmit. Okay, so almost all the expeditions operate split. The DX station will say something like, I'm giving a call sign and saying up 5 or up 5 to 10. That means he's listening 5 to 10 kilohertz up from his transmit frequency. Let's say DX station is on 114.160. He'll say operating. He'll say 200 to 225. What does that mean? It means he's listening 200 to 225. He's operating a minimum of 40 above his transmit frequency. So don't transmit on the DX frequency. To do this, you need to learn how to use your rig's dual VFOs. Almost all current model HF radios have dual VFOs. Back in the days, second VFO, external VFO, was an extra cost accessory, but you need to learn how to operate your AB VFOs to work split. If you're working contests, I'm going to be giving a detailed presentation on contesting immediately following this presentation at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, 1600 UTC. Contesting, simply, it's competitive operating. You try to work as many stations as possible in as many places as possible, as quickly as possible. If you want to operate in a contest, check the contest rules. It gives you the exchange, gives you information about the time and bands of the contest. And again, you can call CQ, operate proactively, or you can search and pounce. That is, tune the band, find stations in the contest that are calling CQ, and you can respond to their CQ. Details on contesting to come at the top of the hour. Let's talk about logging. In the United States, there is no legal requirement to keep a station log any longer. Has not been the case since 1983. But it is useful to keep a record of your operating activity, particularly if you're interested in getting confirmation, QSLs, and if you're going after various awards. So you want to have a log in which you include the date and time in UTC of the contact, the frequency band, and the mode, CW, RIDI, etc. The call sign of the station worked. And the signal report is often helpful. In a log, you can put in notes. You can put the name of the station you worked, where he or she is located, the equipment he was using, you were using, that kind of thing is useful to keep a station log. So how to keep a log? Well, you can go old school and you can still keep a log on paper. The ARRL still sells this logbook that you see here on the left, the ARRL Amateur Radio Station Logbook. Back in the day where the logging was a requirement, they used to sell this thing called a mini log. I don't think they have this one anymore in their bookstore. And you used to keep this in your car, and you could write down the contacts that you made in your mobile operation. These days, of course, everybody loves to be modern. Well, not everybody. A lot of people still keep a paper log. Some people keep no log. But if you want to keep a log on your computer, there are two types of logging programs. There are lots of them. There are general purpose loggers like DX Log, DX4, and DX Keeper, Mac Logger for the Mac. They help you keep track of not only your contacts, but they'll help you track the various awards that you're after that I'm going to mention in a minute. There are specialized logs for contesting. They have certain features that are particularly useful for contesters. The most popular, I think it's safe to say, is N1MM Plus. It's a Windows logger, and it's free of charge. WriteLog is a commercial program which is also very popular, and I'm not a Mac or a Linux guy, but there are specialized contest loggers for Mac and Linux as well. And how to get those QSLs? Well, again, you can send and exchange printed cards. A lot of hams still do that. Domestically, if you're going to exchange cards as a courtesy, it's good to send a self-addressed stamped envelope. SASE or green stamps or a dollar bill or something. Postage, I think, just went up to 62 cents or something like that, and the price of envelopes goes up. I respond to all cards. I like to get an SASE because it's just more convenient. I don't have to hunt up an envelope. I don't have to address it. I don't have to find a stamp and so forth. There are still QSL managers for DX stations that these are stateside people who get the log of the DX station, and you send your QSL card to QSL managers. And then there are ingoing and outgoing QSL bureaus. The incoming bureaus in the United States go by call sign district. There's an incoming DX bureau for each call district. If you go online and just search, 3rd District QSL Bureau, you'll get a result which will tell you what organization is doing incoming QSLs. In the 2nd call district, it's the North Jersey DX Association. The way QSL bureaus work, incoming bureaus, is you either send them stamped envelopes, or more often you purchase return envelope credits from them, either by sending them a check or by going on one of the online payment services to send them money to fund the postage. The ARRL outgoing QSL service for members. If you go to the ARRL website, there's an explanation of the outgoing QSL service and how that works. And electronically, the most popular electronic confirmation service is the ARRL logbook of the world. It's free to register and use. It automatically tracks all your awards and stuff. EQSL is somewhat popular, not as much as Logbook of the World, and ClubLog is an electronic QSL service particularly for DX petitioners. Lots of operating awards you can go after using those confirmations. DX Century Club for 100 contacts in 100 countries. 5-band worked all states, worked all continents. Lots of awards out there to go after. So let's do, in the last, let's say, a couple of minutes, real quick, let's look at how you use your HF transceiver. There are a lot of controls on HF transceiver that don't exist on VHF, UHF radios. On the transmit side, RF power output determines RF power output, how many watts you're putting out, CW digital SSB. For phone, there's a mic level control, which gives you your audio input, speech processing and compression. Speech processing increases the RF power and adds punch to your audio. When you use speech processing, you want to observe your automatic level control limit that appears on your meter. There's oftentimes a transmit audio equalization control, which will let you tailor your audio with the highs and lows for maximum intelligibility. There's oftentimes a transmit audio monitor that listens to how the effects of these vario controls affect your mic audio without you having to actually transmit. And of course, when you go on the air, ask for audio reports from the stations you work. Ask them how it sounds. Here's a brief explanation of how audio compression works. It increases the sideband talk power. As you can see here on the left side of this screen, this is a typical signal single sideband. The way it works is the power output of your radio determines by the I'll call it the loudness of your voice. And what happens here is because of the way speech intelligibility works, your average talk power is down here and you hit these peaks here. When you put in speech compression or audio processing, it squeezes down these peaks while it expands up these averages, and you get this nice signal scope looking thing here. Okay, so that will increase your peak talk power. Okay. Transmit keying controls, VOX, voice operated transmit. This, the transmitter is keyed by sensing your speech. When you talk into the microphone, it keys your transmitter without you having to touch anything. There are sensitivity and delay controls for your VOX capabilities. In other words, how loudly you have to talk to key the VOX so that room noise or fan noise from your equipment doesn't key the VOX. CW break-in, automatic switching between transmit and receive. There's full break-in or QSK, and what happens here is it switches from transmit to receive immediately when the key contacts are open. You press down on your straight key, and immediately when you release the key, it puts your radio back into receive. Contact close, transmit, contact open, receive. Semi break-in, when the key tacks are open, the switch to receive is delayed by a set duration called semi break-in, and that's usually controlled by a VOX setting. Automatic antenna tuners. This is something almost all modern radios have. It automatically matches an out of resonance antenna to impedance of 50 ohms. The reason this is important with modern radios to maintain full transmit power, modern solid state transmitters, they fold back or lower the output power to mismatch antenna loads. That prevents damage to the final output power transistors. So your ATU, your automatic antenna tuner, enables you to quickly, without any dials or switches, by pressing a button, it will automatically tune to a 50 ohm match. Now, the thing about internal automatic antenna tuners is they're limited range, and they generally won't match in most radios anything beyond a SWR mismatch of more than 3 to 1. Receive audio controls. This is where modern transceivers really come into their own. AF gain, automatic frequency gain. RF gain, radio frequency gain, manually adjust the receiver sensitivity. It's usually left at maximum in conjunction with the AGC. AGC, automatic gain control, adjusts the receiver sensitivity in response to changes in signal strength. You set it to fast for CW and slow for single sideband. Sensitivity controls, an RF attenuator, usually is a button or a dial that reduces the receiver sensitivity by a set amount. This is useful for reducing noise and for reducing adjacent channel interference. RF preamp does the reverse of a attenuator. It increases receiver sensitivity by a set amount. Radios that have FM on them usually have a squelch control. It mutes the receiver when no signal is present. You leave it wide open except for FM. RIT, receiver incremental tuning. Yaesu calls this a clarifier. This lets you change the receive frequency without changing the transmit frequency. This enables you to tune in a signal, like when I alluded to earlier, when I have someone answer me and they're not quite on my frequency because they think it should be ending in a 0. I can tune them in without changing my transmit frequency. XIT, transmit incremental tuning, does the reverse. It lets you change your transmit frequency without changing your receive frequency. And what will happen there is that wait, back up, hold on. what will happen there is you can use that for a split in the absence of a second VFO. Here are interference controls. Noise reduction or noise filtering reduces steady background noises. And let's see over here, frequency. Noise blanker reduces pulsating background noises. This is what you get like ignition noise. Notch filtering lets you change your band pass to look like this. So here's your interfering signal, and the notch eliminates that and lets you hear the rest of the signal. And your IF control, this shifts your interfering, your IF bandwidth. Here's your interfering signal. You move your IF band pass so that you hear the desired signal, moves the interfering signal out of the band pass. Bandwidth controls, here's an example of that. Your desired signal and two interfering signals are inside your band pass. You put in a narrow filter and it lets you hear your desired signal and puts your interfering signals outside the band pass. And a variable width filter is a combination of the two, lets you control those parameters manually. So we're out of time. I'm sorry, we have to make room for the next presentation, which will be mine. If you have any questions, you can email me directly, ks2g@arrl.net. As I said, this slide deck and a link to a recording on our YouTube panel will be appearing on the HRU website in a week or two. There are older versions of this presentation already up on the website and already up on the YouTube channel. So again, my apologies for not going quite fast enough to allow online questions right at the moment, but do not hesitate to email me, ks2g@arrl.net. And please think about supporting HRU. Go to our website, press on the donate button, and if you go to our YouTube channel, please subscribe. That doesn't cost anything and it helps us maintain the channel. And I think that puts us out of time. George, thanks for letting me run over here a minute or two. 73 to everybody, and I hope you'll stick around for another 7 or 8 minutes for my presentation on contesting. 73, everybody.